Hi, my name's Phil. I like talking about politics, and in this video, I like to discuss the only Labour Party conference motion on proportional representation. And it's possible that you've seen a report on the result that makes it sound quite bad. It's not that bad. But it's also possible you've seen a report that makes it sound quite good. It's not that good either. But there are a few branches to this issue about the votes that I want to talk about. It's going to get a bit messy. But first, if you'd like to be notified of daily news and politics, please subscribe to the channel and click the bell notification icon. So there are three things that I want to discuss here, three main points, and I want to try and do it quickly, it's going to be a long one. And they are why I think proportional representation is an absolute must before the country can start to connect people with politics again. Secondly, why the vote, which was a bizarre split, went as it did. And third, and this is the contentious bit, why those on the hard left really should back proportional representation because it will give them exactly what they want. So first things first, why I want proportional representation. Now, I do want it, and for me, it's the most important thing. I will accept a non-Tory government abandoning all sorts of things if they would just put in proportional representation first. That being said, I've done a video in the past on why Labour cannot formally put it in their manifesto as something they want to do in a campaign. All gets very messy. I'll try and remember to put a link below, but every time I say this, I forget. But I ain't got time for that now. Proportional representation. I feel we absolutely need it. See, we first past the post, the Conservatives in this country benefit. They get the right-wing vote, because who else is there? At the last election, sure, there was the Brexit Party, and that did cost them. But they weren't everywhere. If they'd have been everywhere, it would have cost them the election. But generally, that's not normal. The Conservatives can rely on the right-wing vote. And then what they do is they target the centre vote to push them over the line to victory. Because they just have to concentrate on just that little bit there. There are other things in their favour as well, of course there are. A mainstream media that bats for them. Plenty of donations for their war chest in return for corrupt public contracts. The fact that the Conservative Party, unlike their main opposition in England and Wales at least, I think the SNP are fairly focused, they are completely laser focused on election strategy. They don't get sidetracked with nonsense. But although we are not a two-party system in this country, the Prime Minister can only ever be either Labour or Conservative, realistically. There was that little window for a Prime Minister of neither party in a government of national unity in 2019, but that was a freak event and that was turned down, so it didn't happen. So basically, Labour need to win to get rid of the Tories. But they can't do what the Conservatives do because their vote is split all over the place. They can't just focus on one bit. It's all over the place. The only way Labour can win with first past the post is with cooperation with the Liberal Democrats at least. I mean, look at the way the polls have behaved in the past month. You can look at the gap between Labour and Conservatives and go, oh, it's narrowed, oh, it's widened again, widened, narrow now. You know, Labour making a right mess of it. Labour catch up to the Conservatives, then fall away. But when they fell away, it wasn't because the Conservatives were going ahead. The Conservatives were keeping the same share. How they did this amid the petrol crisis, the gas crisis, the ongoing mess of Brexit and COVID in general, I cannot tell you. I cannot tell you how it's not hurting them in the polls. But that's the way it is. But Labour fell away because they were losing share to the Liberal Democrats and the Greens, and then the next week, they may regain some of it back again. And the same thing happens in an election. They just take votes from each other and the Tories win with a minority of the popular vote. It gives them 100% of the power with, at the last election, 43% of the votes. Come the next election, if Labour do not work with other anti-Tory parties, the Tories will win again because the same thing will happen again and again. If other parties work together, however, they actually stand a good chance of displacing them. It's really that simple. Proportional representation ends this. You know, you can vote for whomever you wish. And your vote isn't wasted. In hundreds of constituencies around the country, your vote's wasted if you're not going to vote for one of the two that can realistically take it. And even in quite a lot of them, you know, there's one party that's on well over 50%, it's wasted then even. You know, many in Labour want to see this done now. Now, I've said over the past year or so that I've increasingly seen support for it on Labour Party forums, as well as, crucially, I haven't really seen much in the way of opposition voices to it. They've fallen away to almost nothing. So a motion was put to the Labour Party conference this last week. The results are interesting. You may have seen them. I'll go through them. The raw result, the basic result was that Labour should adopt proportional representation. 58% against it, 42% in favour. And you go, okay, Phil, that looks like pretty robust opposition to me. Yes, but that's because it isn't just Labour members who voted on that. Unions get a 50% block of the vote. The actual membership voted 80% in favour. So 80% of the Labour delegates at the conference voted in favour of it. Proportional representation. The reason the motion failed was because 95% of the union delegates voted against it. So the support in Labour is overwhelming. The problem is that the unions are clearly wholly opposed to it. Now, I'm not into moaning. I couldn't moan and gnash my teeth. This is ridiculous. Labour clearly want it. Why would the unions block it when there's a clear thing of the members here? You know, it's a little bit like with the House of Commons and House of Lords. Because the House of Lords isn't elected, if there's a manifesto promise that the elected government have made, they tend not to block that, even if they think it's a bad idea. Why wouldn't the unions do the same? You know, the Labour members are overwhelmingly supporting this thing. Why would the unions block it? But there's no point in moaning about this. See, there's a problem that proportional representation is the solution to, in my view. And then there are problems that are blocking proportional representation, so we need to tackle them, not moan about them. You know, there's a little aside. There was another little line from Keir Starmer in his speech that was quite good. A little bit of a pop at some Labour MPs, I think. He said he didn't go into Parliament to just vote and lose and then tweet about it afterwards, that he wants to actually do something. Well, that's right. You know, so that's what I want to do. I don't just want to moan about it. What are the issues? So what's the problem for unions? Well, there are the arguments they used, which are both crap, as I'll explain, and then there's the real reason. So the arguments they gave were twofold. First of all, they said it was a distraction. The motion was a distraction from important matters. So, well, if that's the case, why did they vote at all? It's not the Labour leadership that brought this motion forward. This was Labour Party members. Also, there were lots of motions, some of which, you know, you could certainly argue were distractions. There was a motion to state that the AUKUS deal was a threat to international peace. Now, I'm not in favour of this myself, but as I mentioned in an earlier video, statements about foreign affairs when you're in opposition are worthless. Who cares? But the unions didn't label that vote as a distraction, did they? Oh, no, apparently, commenting on a deal between the United States and Australia. Oh, absolutely a good use of conference time. A motion on something that could actually improve Labour's electoral chances in the future. Oh, that's a complete distraction. Nah, that's bollocks. The second reason given was that there was a campaign in 2011 and it was lost. Well, there wasn't. There was a campaign for electoral reform, but it was the AV system. But I don't want to split hairs. There was a referendum for Westminster electoral reform, and it did indeed lose. But here's the thing. The union that made that statement, and I either can't remember which union it was or I never knew, they've just said that because a campaign lost a vote 10 years ago, we should just give up on it. Now, I'm going to say here and now, any representative of any union that gives up on a cause just because it lost a vote has got no business being involved in that union. I'd be outraged if someone representing my union said such a thing. Such an attitude is an absolute disgrace for a group that exists to campaign for its members, against all odds sometimes. A person who gives up when a campaign doesn't work first time is an absolute failure of a person, and I don't want them being involved in my union. So that's a load of crap as well, because actually, in reality, unions don't give up on campaigns. They're quite tenacious. They don't fall at the first hurdle. So if the stated reasons are lies, then the real reason obviously has to be something they can't admit to in public. And I'll tell you what it is. It was actually alluded to by someone who wrote a piece, I think it was in The Guardian. I'm afraid I can't remember who, but it was hardly an original thought. It is quite a common opposition to those, particularly on the left in Labour, who are against it. So the argument goes, with proportional representation, Labour would not win an absolute majority of seats without an absolute majority of the votes, of course, that's obvious. And this won't occur. So they argue that they will constantly be having to form coalitions. So this particular person said, so that would make the Liberal Democrats kingmakers. Now, I'll tackle why I think that's a poor argument in a moment, but that's the real reasons unions are opposed to this. See, right now, unions have an immense amount of power over Labour. You know, unlike the leader of other political parties who have to persuade maybe their membership to do certain things. Actually, I don't think Boris Johnson, leader of the Conservatives, has to persuade anyone if he wants to bring something in. But Labour leaders have to align a lot of what they do with groups whose aims are not always the same. So when people complain about Labour leaders, past or present, about, oh, why don't they just do this? Why don't they just do that? Oh, this would be an obvious thing to do. You've got to understand they don't actually have as much power as a leader in a different party. You know, it's good when all the aims of the various stakeholders align, but they don't always align. There's a lot of layers in Labour. So the unions would be ceding some of their influence over the party in order to form a government. You know, they'd have to agree positions with a political party, let's say the Liberal Democrats, over whom those unions have no power. Now, why I think the argument... So that's the reason, basically, why the unions don't want this. It's maddening, but they'd rather Labour were in opposition and they had control over Labour than for Labour to be in government if it meant ceding some influence. Now, why I think the argument is nonsense is because it is true. You would hardly ever see a Labour government, as we'd known them in the past, though New Zealand has demonstrated that it is possible. But it is unlikely. Ordinarily, you could buy this logic if the UK was a bit like the USA. You know, you can understand why no one wants to go for electoral reform in the USA because the two main parties switch quite regularly. Democrats in charge, then Republicans in charge, then Democrats in charge, and so on and so on. Doesn't actually happen in this country. That's not how it works. The Conservatives are always in power. Labour only get in when they work with others. In 1997, Labour won with an electoral pact with the Liberal Democrats. Not as strong as the one I would like to see. It wasn't putting candidates down or anything like that. Not putting them down in this sort of old yellow way. But, you know, it was a weaker non-aggression pact. But it was an agreement nonetheless to limit the damage on each other by splitting the vote against each other. It was an anti-Tory agreement. Before that, Labour hadn't won since the mid-century. Before I was born, that was it. I'm 45. There's only been one Labour government in my life. What's better? A Labour government that has to compromise with the Liberal Democrats, or the Greens, or whomever, or the Conservatives. And if the fear is that, yes, but sometimes the Lib Dems, those devils, will side with the Conservatives for a coalition instead of Labour, as they did in 2010, then even that is better than what we have now. First of all, the Lib Dems actually learned their lessons from that period and would not... I'm not saying they wouldn't align with the Conservatives. Of course they would sometimes. But they wouldn't do it and enable such a hard right-wing set of policies as austerity because they learned that lesson. They suffered very badly. Also, secondly, that still means more Labour governments than we have now. And what's more, the Labour Party members are very much of this view. But the unions are dead against it. Now, I don't think there's any way to persuade them otherwise because their real reason is not the one stated. See, if you want to argue someone's points, they have to make those points. Because they're not making the real points, you can't debate them, can you? So it's both good and bad. It's good because we have proof that an overwhelming majority of Labour want the party to adopt PR. It's bad because we need to persuade the remaining 20% or so to also do it in order to pressure the unions to accept it. So how do we do this? Now, this is where I need to speculate. And I'm going to speculate that many of the 20% who voted against it, the members, are on the hard left of the party. If so, these are the very people who benefit the most from proportional representation, which is why I'm not sure if it was or it wasn't. See, there was a fringe meeting at the conference of the Socialist Campaign Group. They don't like Keir Starmer, should we put it like that? They want him gone. They want Richard Burgon installed. Ignore the chatter, by the way. Whenever you hear some people in this group saying, oh, should have Andy Burnham as a leader, it's like, they're never going to back a Blairite. Oh, Angela Rayner, oh yeah, she's good, yeah, we'll have her. They just want to use them as Trojan horses. They have attacked both of them quite viciously at times. But anyway, they were saying that they want Richard Burgon. They were saying at this meeting that they have 36 Labour MPs on their side. They only need 4 more with the new rules to displace Starmer. This is incorrect. In fact, even attempting to do so secures Starmer. If they want Starmer gone, the way they're going about it is the opposite of the way they need to work. See, here's what would happen. So let's say they get that few more. Let's say they get to 40. That is enough to get their candidate on a leadership ballot. So Starmer steps down and there's going to be a new leadership contest. So if they had 4 more, they'd have enough. if they backed a single candidate to get them onto the ballot. Absolutely true. But because of that, the remaining MPs will back Starmer even if he ultimately fails. Here's the issue. If Starmer loses the election, I think he should stand down. Depends what you mean by lose. If he can form a government, if he can displace the Tories, of course he should remain. But if he loses, I think he should stand down. Because I don't think, the one thing I admire about the Tories is they do not allow leaders to lose an election and still be the leader. You don't give them another chance at it. If they lose, they've lost. Go away. If there was a general election triggered a few months after becoming leader, fine. But even if it was this November, I would still say Starmer, he hasn't really had enough time, but he should go. But the issue is this. Richard Burgon is bloody useless. Even if the SCG backed someone who wasn't completely incompetent, they would still be someone with the mindset who thinks it's better to be in opposition than to compromise to gain power. But gaining power without compromise is impossible for Labour. Other MPs, if they think there's a chance of an SCG candidate getting on the leadership ballot, they won't just back Starmer against any challenge, they'll beg him not to stand down. Even if they lost an election and he wants to stand down, he goes, look, I failed, sorry, we need someone else. They'll go, no, because we could end up with Burgon, for Christ's sake. They'll beg him to stay. The tribalism in Labour is deeply destructive. On both sides, they treat each other as greater enemies than the Tories. Not picking on the SCG here, this applies to all of them. All of these cliquey little groups. It's like give them a choice of government, and what they do in this list of governments they'd like, at the top they put their own vision of Labour. Right, okay. Then you have all the other parties, including the Conservatives in there. Then at the bottom, underneath the monster raving loony party, you have any other variation of Labour, even if it's a little bit different to theirs. No, that's right at the bottom. That's not allowed. And the SCG aren't really Labour. They're just socialists who know that the Socialist Workers' Party is just a drunken slanging match about the ills of the world that doesn't do anything. They need Labour as their only shot at power because they sort of do want to change the world. They realise they need electoral power to do so. But with proportional representation, what would happen is the Labour Party would split because they're not really Labour. They would split off. They'd join the party they really like. And then they'd become large enough, they'd get enough votes to get some MPs. That would then raise their profile in the news. And then they could win some more MPs over time. It would be like the Greens in Germany, how that worked with proportional representation. Over time, they'd establish themselves as a minor political party, like the Lib Dems, and then they could force concessions from other parties to form a coalition. You'd have a more contented and focused Labour Party, so they would do better as well. So you'd get these coalitions, you'd get these anti-Tory coalitions all the time. They would get the leaders they wanted, and they would get a share of power. Opposing PR is madness for everyone that isn't a Tory. But those are my thoughts. Sorry I went on for a while. Let me know yours in the comments below. Hope you found the video interesting. If you did, don't forget to click the like button. And if you'd like to support the channel further, please also click the Patreon link for details. And until next time, I'll see you later.